She went to that exclusive party to be seen, to glide among familiar faces under chandeliers that measured social currency in candorless smiles. The invitations had been embossed. The valet knew her name. Yanlu had worn the silver bracelet her grandmother had given her, the thin one with a small clasp that clicked like a metronome against the rhythm of her wrist. It caught the light the moment she crossed the threshold, and someone noticed. That was what social life did for her. It glazed her in a light that made everything look intact. He was at the edge of the terrace, where the shadows pooled and the city's neon was a rash of color below. He called himself G when he finally stepped closer, as if the letter could contain the speed of the promise between them. He spoke without grand declarations, an easy laugh, an observation about the rooftop smoke that made her smile. And the world of crystal and chatter shrank to the span of a cigarette shared between two people leaning against the low wall. The party buzzed behind them. Their conversation was cigarette smoke and small confessions. It was incendiary because it felt like discovery. Two strangers unspooling a map of each other's wants under an indifferent sky. They left that night with the same abruptness that had so many of her evenings, the city at their feet, the secret air of having found one another. They did not make vows. There was no dramatic kiss under a fountain. There was a bracelet left snug on her wrist, a borrowed scarf, a promise that sounded like a plan more than a commitment. The chemistry was not loud, no backstage scandal to be recounted in breathless tones, but it was a flame that licked quietly, enough to warm the edges of Yanlu's life. Nights afterward were a montage of rooftops. They would stand with the city's electricity humming beneath them, watching the neon smear itself across the river. G smoked like a man mapping his own quiet habits, and Yanlu, who had always been practiced at being watched, found watching him a new practice entirely. He had the habit of tapping a lighter twice before striking it, as if measuring whether something inside him would flare. He spoke of travel in the present tense, as if it were an ornament he could put on and take off. She told him things that were not usually spoken in the salons she frequented, about the weight of obligations, about a grandmother's cookbook that always smelled faintly of star anise. The bracelet mattered more than she would have admitted. She polished it with the hem of a napkin once, absent-mindedly, and G watched as if the movement itself were a private ritual. It fit snugly while she grew used to the idea that a different kind of life might be possible, a life where mornings could be occupied by the small domestic work she had always admired but never claimed. She thought, for a while, that the way his hand found hers across a table, the easy alignment of their knees on uneven terrace tiles, might reconfigure the parts of her that had been kept for show. The social machinery hummed in the periphery. There were invitations addressed with calligraphy, events where her presence was expected, chairs reserved and name cards waiting. People murmured about the new pair at the edge of the party, placing bets in the polite way the privileged gamble. Yet none of those murmurs seemed dangerous. They were the harmless clinking of chipped glass, the background soundtrack to a life going on as it had before. The danger, when it arrived, was quieter. It came as all quiet betrayals do, through a doorway into a private hallway, with the click of a doorknob more final than any argument. "You're leaving," she said, standing in the entryway, the bracelet cool against the bones of her wrist. Her voice was measured, but inside it carried the stabbed surprise of someone who had trusted a map that had been folded differently than she thought. G's face was a dim photograph. He said too quickly, "It's an opportunity. It's for me and—" He stopped. He mouthed Sarah's name like it was a new fact carved into the air. Yanlu felt the room tilt, as if someone had bumped the map she had been following. The chairs, the candles, the framed photographs of charity galas all slid to an angle she could not reconcile. "You never told me," she said. The words were not a demand so much as a register of the world rearranging itself. "I didn't know how," he said. He sounded small, as if the admission shrank him. "They offered me a post that starts next month. Sarah, she's involved. It's complicated." She looked at him, at the tilt of his mouth that had once suggested happiness in small commensurates, at the way he refused to meet her eyes. There was 1,000 ways to measure infidelity, and this one felt like arithmetic, promise divided by other people. She thought of the terraces, of the cigarette twice struck, and she imagined all the silent evenings numbered in advance. "You left a boarding pass on the table," she said, sensing the physicality of the proof, the life's itinerary folded like a confession. The bracelets at her wrist caught the light again, and she felt, in a corner of herself that was not meant to be examined publicly, that certain ornaments were only good at reflecting. He reached for her hand, and she allowed it merely to pass through. "I didn't mean to hurt you." The phrase did not land as absolution. It was a rope tied loosely around a stone. Outside, invitations went unaccepted for reasons that no one announced. A seat reserved for her at a winter charity dinner remained empty, not because she was out of favor in anything official, but because the gossip that had congealed in private parlors had made her a different type of woman, someone whose evenings could not be assumed any longer. At luncheons, there was a new silence where previously there had been easy laughter. Once, a woman leaned in and asked, in a voice that tasted like sugar and leaf, "Is everything all right?" Yanlu smiled and found the muscles along her mouth had less practice than the rest of her life. Lin Tai, who had always been blunt in the way that friends must be, did not bother with the curlicues of social niceties. "You could leave," she said over tea. The line of her jaw was exact. She measured practical exit strategies with the same casualness she used to rotate an orange while talking. "You could burn the boarding pass and move to Shanghai or somewhere where no one knows you." Yanlu considered the imagined map of flight. There was a clarity to the partial life of leaving. New city, new name, new set of small domesticities. But even as she imagined it, she felt the ache of dereliction. Not of the parties lost, but of the possible person she would leave behind. Someone not yet tended. Someone with marbles in a pocket and a bruise on an ankle. The thought arrived like a foreign order printed in blood. Mr. Li had been an anchor in her life for years, a man whose presence made her apartment feel less like an exhibit and more like a lived house. He had cooked for her grandmother, polished the silver, kept the ledger of small things. He was not family by blood, but he belonged in the family of habits that sustained her. When Mr. Li collapsed, it was as if the apartment inhaled sharply and forgot its next breath. The hospital smelled like antiseptic and boiled rice, two smells that, in Yanlu's mind, were braided together into one indelible memory. Dr. Lin moved around the bed with quiet efficiency, her hands and answers measured like surgical instruments. Machines made even the smallest sound enormous. Mr. Li's hand, wrapped in a thin blanket, felt like an artifact. His voice at the edge of sleep skittered like a moth. He did not speak in grand gestures. He arranged his possessions with the tenderness of someone making a list for a future cook. The cookbook with the stained page of star anise, an old tin of marbles, a silver bracelet that was not his but always found its way into his pocket at Christmas. Little things that constituted a life's ledger. He produced a folded letter from beneath the pillow, and in the dim light his fingers trembled just enough to make Yanlu watch him as if he were rehearsing. The letter smelt faintly of cigarette smoke and ink. He asked her to read it later, but he spoke more plainly than he had in years. "If anything, Ja, take care of Ja." Ja was a small boy whose face had been described to Yanlu by Mr. Li in passing, the way gardeners might describe a sapling when they intend to plant it in the shade of an orchard. The image she had of him before the hospital visit was a child's outline in a doorway. Small shoulders, a shirt with a fraying hem, marbles in the pocket. Mr. Li had spoken of him with a tenderness that was not theatrical. "Ja has my appetite for soup," he said once, and made a sound folk songs would have taken to pigeonhole. The letter contained practicalities, a small savings account in Mr. Li's name, a list of debts neatly crossed out, and instructions. There was a scribbled note in the margin with 3 dots, a small symbol he used when he hesitated, and a short sentence that looked like an order and a plea. "The kitchen," it said. "Keep him in the kitchen of his life." The phrasing was inelegant and perfect. It meant preserve the domestic heart. It did not mean live forever in grief. It meant teach him ginger and how to tear it. Let spices learn to float before the slow stir, to watch a family be more than the public faces they showed the world. It meant fold him into the small rituals that make someone know what a home tastes like. Yanlu did not immediately accept guardianship the way a proposal might be accepted and celebrated. There was the practical, legal forms handled by people who spoke in terms like temporary custody in rooms with fluorescent lights, and there was the ache of transition. Ja arrived like a weather event, sudden, unsettled, and requiring immediate measurement. He kept his marbles in a dented tin, and insisted upon a lone marble that he carried as if it were a compass. He had a bruise on his ankle, a story told in shards that he volunteered unevenly, and an appetite for soup that was as sharp as his gaze. Days became rotated tasks. Yanlu burned a boarding pass in the sink, an image of a possible self she had been tempted to step into, and rinsed the ash down with water, watching it swirl like a small failure. She paused before it reached the drain and thought of Mr. Lee's hands. The bracelet at her wrist pressed small dents into the skin when she pulled it too tight in worry. The cookbook was a map, its pages stamped with oil and time. She learned to press its pages flat without tearing the corners, to find the old stains whose names mattered more than the recipes. She taught Ja how to tear ginger, to hold it in a fist and rip against the grain, to let the smell intoxicate the room. He laughed the first time he tasted broth that had been carefully coaxed into flavor by patience and the steady hand of an adult who was learning to be exact. Marbles surfaced as a language of their own. Ja rolled them down the banister and assigned them stories. A blue one was always the ocean. A green one would be the corner shop. He liked to line them up on the windowsill and watch the light hit them like tiny planets. Yanlu bought a jar with a lid and told herself it was as practical as lock and key. She would empty them at night and count them the way she counted guests at a party. The social consequences that had whispered at the edges of her life did not explode into anything theatrical. There were no headline-chasing photographers at her door. The ruin was quieter. A few unreturned RSVP cards tucked into envelopes, and a dinner invitation that remained the only thing on an otherwise polite table. A chair at a public benefit remained vacant with her name on it because she could not stand to take the photograph that night. It was almost ruin in the way a long rain can almost ruin a day. Enough to dampen some things, not enough to wash them away entirely. Months passed in what felt like a sequence of rituals, each one remapping Yanlu's internal geography. There was the small ceremony of polishing the silver bracelet when she felt grief nearing the surface. She would lay the bracelet on a cloth and rub it until its edges shone like a promise. Sometimes she would find lipstick on the cloth and remember the party's noise like a galaxy far away. She learned to make soup with patience, as if that patience could be bottled and handed back to Ja on nights when he wouldn't sleep. When he traced the old stains on the cookbook, his finger mapping an accident into a memory, he became more human to her than any headline. There were also quiet humiliations in the legal forms that had to be signed. The bank asked for ID, paperwork that required proof of residence, a signature that read like an agreement to become responsible on paper as well as in life. These were not melodramatic scenes. They were bureaucratic and slow. Lin Tai sat in the solicitor's office with a brow that nodded in annoyance and forced a smile on behalf of Yanlu when forms stalled. "You don't have to be heroic," she said softly. "You can just be competent." Yanlu wanted to be both. She wanted to be competent enough to make sure Ja had what he needed at school, and heroic enough to make it seem like she had planned this all along. Mostly, she discovered that the domestic felt like a new language. The verbs involved damage control and daily concreteness rather than public applause. She learned to mend a pocket with the neatness of someone sewing up a wound, to peel an apple in a spiral until Ja cheered at the length of it. Once a neighbor brought over a casserole and said, "We heard." There was a small pity in the tone that felt like a hand on the shoulder. Yanlu accepted the casserole and smiled as if the meal were a tiny diplomatic victory. At night, when the city dimmed and the apartment's lamps made pools of hush, she would take out the small tin where Mr. Li had kept his marbles and shake one into her palm, for luck, superstition, or habit. The marble could be anything if she allowed it, a memory, a deciding coin. Sometimes she would roll it along the windowsill and watch the reflection ripple like a small future being tested for solidity. The invitation to flee never entirely left her. It visited in dreams where she was walking away from the apartment with a suitcase and nothing in her hands but the bracelet. It visited in the crispness of a boarding pass that she had once burned, but whose ashes still seemed lodged in the faucet. It visited, too, in the unread email from G that arrived like a match struck at the edge of sleep, brief, ambiguous, polite. She could, she imagined, click and open it and read reasons and regrets and a soft request for reunion. But she didn't. She let it sit like a ghost in the screen of her phone, unread and therefore uninviting for the drama it might contain. The real test came months later, on the rooftop, on a night when the city seemed to have condensed its whole luminous gravity into a single dry wind. The rooftop had been their cathedral in the beginning, a place of cigarettes and small promises. Now, with a jar of marbles in one pocket and the weight of a child's future in the other, Yanlu climbed the same faint stairs. The bracelet on her wrist felt cooler against her skin, as if it had absorbed the hush of domestic practice. She brought Ja up with her. He held a marble as if it were a talisman. He saw the city like a pattern to be memorized. Lin Tai arrived soon after, practical with a scarf and a serious jaw. The wind tossed the pages of an unpaid bill someone had left on a casino stool nearby. They stood like three figures on a small stage, where the city's neon hissed at the edges. "You could still go," Lin Tai said, for clarity's sake. Her voice had the bluntness of someone who loves without illusions. "You could leave. You don't have to keep this up for sentiment's sake." Yanlu looked at Ja, who was rolling a marble along the rooftop's rim. The marble found a dent, and as it rolled, it caught the city's light and split it into a small universe. She thought of Mr. Li's 3 dots, and his instruction, the kitchen of his life. She thought of the nights at the party when the flame of something new had felt easy and possible. She thought of the faint hum of her empty chair. "What do you want?" Lin Tai asked, not as a rhetorical question, but as a ledger that demanded an answer. Yanlu watched Ja place the marble into a jar she had brought up by intuition rather than plan. She imagined a life where she left for unknown mornings and took with her only a suitcase and the shards of glamorous evenings. She imagined Ja searching varnished furniture for a child's hand to hold and finding no one. "I can teach him to make the soup," she said, and in that sentence there was an acceptance that had the gravity of a vow. It was not grander than it needed to be, it was not cinematic, it was merely an accounting, a life shifted towards someone who required steady hands and the ordinariness of a boiling pot. Lin Tai's face softened, and the wind seemed to take the edge off the city. The rooftop had become a crucible of decision, not because the stakes were headline-making, but because they were intimate. Yanlu let the marble roll from her palm and watched it meet Ja's small fingers. The gesture was unadorned and complete. In the months that followed, there were gestures that resembled rituals more than rehabilitation. On mornings when the light came in flat and gray, Yanlu would tear ginger and drop it into hot oil, and the smell would coax Ja from his bedroom as efficiently as any alarm. She would tell him the old stories of why certain spices were used, not as lectures, but as tenders of a narrative that could seat a child at table and make the family of moments visible. Ja learned to stir with his elbow, to let the wooden spoon rest on the rim so the broth would not boil over. He learned to press his thumb into the simmer to test for salt. There were nights when he asked blunt questions. Who is he? Why did he go? And there were nights he simply wanted someone to sit with him by the window and watch the marbles make moonlight. At times, grief leaked through like a slow drip, but the domestic work of nourishment seemed to plug the holes. It did not make everything whole, it made a life that could be inhabited. Legal paperwork resolved itself with the sort of tedium only adulthood knows. Signatures, notarized pages, an agreement that gave Ja a name on a school's roster and a guardian who could sign permission slips for field trips. Dr. Lin signed a medical note that allowed for parental decisions, and a small bank clerk handed Yanlu the key to a modest account for Ja's future with a solemnity that felt like a benediction. Mr. Li's savings were small, and enough to buy a month of time and groceries and nothing more. It was not heroic, it was enough. There were also nights when the social world pressed its face to the window. Former acquaintances would smile when they saw Yanlu on the street, but their eyes slid away from hers when they asked where she had been. She received invitations with longer than usual pauses, as if the senders were consulting some manual for what to say to a woman who had been at the edges of a story. She felt, sometimes, as if the life she had chosen, one that involved soup and marbles and the clinking of a bracelet at her wrist, was somehow less visible, as if it existed at a smaller scale than the lives that were photographed. She did not mind the smaller scale, she treasured it. She found in it an artistry that no gala could afford. Once, Ja held the cookbook open to a particular stain and looked at it like a map. "Who made the mark?" he asked. "Your grandfather," Yanlu said. She had no familial obligation to him, but his memory was rich in the dust of the apartment. It made the room a place of lineage. She noticed how Ja's fingers blurred over the letters, and how he learned to identify a dish by the way a stain arranged itself. In teaching him, Yanlu discovered her own repair, a reclamation that asked for no endorsements or applause. The beginning and the end of things often arrived in small domestic rituals: a marble placed in a jar, the polishing of a bracelet, a hand on the edge of a simmering pot. One afternoon, as she was washing dishes, the USB, Mr. Li's tin had contained more than marbles, turned up in a drawer where she kept spare keys. She slid it into her laptop's port the way you would open a box of jewelry, and the file was Mr. Li's voice, muffled and soaked in the timbre of an old radio. He spoke of nothing grand. He spoke in the voice of someone making sure the list was complete. "If you are listening to this," he said, "I want you to know that Ja will learn how to stand if you let him. Teach him the soup. Keep his marbles. Keep enough of him small so that he can find his own world." The recording ended with small sounds, an intake of breath, the rustle of a page, and a clinking that was unmistakably the sound of marbles against tin. Yanlu listened until the file played the click 3 times and then stopped. She put the USB into a small tin and slid it into the cookbook like a bookmark, as if preserving the voice could be achieved through placement. The voice was not a solution, it was a companion in the night. The question of G hovered always at the edge of ordinary life. The email remained unopened for months, a soft discipline of refusal. Sometimes she dreamed she opened it and found that he had written himself into a story of regret and reparation. Other nights she imagined it was a succinct note announcing the success of a career, a tone that did not include her. Her life with Ja and the small domestic architecture that sustained them did not require any ending to his story. It required only that she make room for a child to be safe and taught and allowed to imagine. There were moments that reminded her of the early heat of the party, when everything felt possible. Not the same as the past, but echoing it, a distant choir. Ja learned to laugh with the kind of openness that had once been the province of youth and improvised games. He taught her to see a marble as a planet. Once, on a lazy afternoon, he took a marble from the jar and tucked it into her hand for safekeeping, as if recognizing who had been the architect of his new small world. The ultimate choice was not a dramatic throwing aside of a suitcase on a train platform. It was a continuous attuning to the forces that mattered most. Yanlu kept the bracelet, polished it in the evenings, and sometimes pressed it to the skin of her wrist in reverie. She kept her social calendar, but with different priorities. She still went to gatherings when she felt sturdy, but she did so with the knowledge that her center had shifted. At the edge of summer, on a day when the air seemed to hold its breath and then exhaled in a cool silence, she opened the cupboard where she stored small things and found the tin with the USB. She brought it into the kitchen where the light was honest, and the jar of marbles sat like a galaxy on the windowsill. She placed the tin beside the cookbook and felt, for a moment, the weight of two people's lives: Mr. Lee's careful articulation and Ja's small present need. She recorded herself once, half for fun and half for posterity, saying out loud what she would tell Ja as he grew older: that life is not always the brilliant archive of the party, that sometimes love is the refusal to run. She did not want to grandstand. She wanted to offer one small truth that had been hammered into place by days of stirring and washing and comforting. The choice to stay had not been a capitulation to duty only. It had been a generous, stubborn act of building. At night, she placed the bracelet in Ja's small palm and told him the soft story of how the metal had belonged to someone who taught her to be precise with salt and with kindness. He listened like a judge at a small court and pocketed the story like a coin. The apartment smelled always of something cooking: star anise on some nights, ginger on others. And the city hummed below in a way that had stopped meaning worship and began to mean a backdrop. There were practical arrangements that closed with no fanfare: a signature here, a witness there, a notice filed in neat script. There was also the slower, necessary proof of continuity. Ja invited a friend over for soup, and the friend liked the broth and demanded the recipe. Yanlu handed over the stained page from the cookbook without ceremony and watched the beginning of a new small library of people around her table. In time, the unread email from G dwindled in its capacity to antagonize her. The subject line remained the same: an index to a possible past, but it no longer had the power to tilt her day. Once or twice she imagined opening it, reading an account filled with explanations. She imagined the exchange and felt nothing, like the ardor of the rooftop nights. The ardor had been a flash. The work she had chosen was an ember tended with patience. The last night of the story, if such a thing can be named when there is no finality to day-to-day life, came with no thunder. It came with the clink of marbles shelved into their jar, and the soft closing of the cookbook's cover. She placed Mr. Lee's USB back into its tin and slid it beneath a stack of napkins as if preserving a relic. She thought of the rooftop where, months before, she had let a marble roll and had made a choice. She walked to the window and looked at the city's lights like constellations she had once catalogued by their glitter. The bracelet lay heavy on her wrist. Ja, asleep upstairs, was breathing in rhythms that had become hers as well: slow, deep, unquestioning. There was no triumph in her chest, no heroic swell. There was a quiet solidity, like a soup that had been simmering longer than necessary and had finally reached a depth that made it nourishing. There were no reenactments of the past. The party that had birthed a fiery romance existed now in a different register, as a remembered temperature that had once threatened to scorch the edges of her life, but had, in fact, taught her the contours of what must be kept. She had been almost ruined in the sense that her social identity had been rearranged, but what had once been nearly destruction had become a field for reconstruction. The bracelet still caught the light in the evening. The marbles still rolled in their jar. The cookbook bore its stains like a map. The USB contained a voice under which she had learned not to flinch, but to listen. She left one message unread at the top of her phone, an old thing that might have changed everything or nothing. She chose instead to close the kitchen drawer and to stand by the stove where a pot was cooling. She wrapped her hands around the wooden spoon like a small anchor. Outside, the city continued to shine and to hum. If this story reached anyone who had ever wondered whether to run or to build, which would you choose? Share your answer in the comments.